our speaker here in person today, but we will have Andrew here via the internet, the wonderful power of the World Wide Web that we use all the time. So welcome. Andrew will talk for a couple of hours here. We'll take a 1 hour intermission if that's still cool with Andrew, and then go back into it for another 2 after that. And that's going to start right away here. After that, we'll do our roundtable, but that's not nearly as exciting. So I'll let Andrew have the floor here. I'm going to go grab a computer and start typing along if I need to.
All right, awesome. Hello, everybody. Yeah, as Gavin said, my name's Andrew. I'm a principal gameplay animator at Brace Yourself Games, and I've been invited to chat with you folks about what I do. And I thought I'd do a little demonstration, kind of to show you, a day in the life of a gameplay animator. So I've thrown together this presentation called Gameplay Animation in Maya and Unreal, a day in the life of a gameplay animator. So yeah, I actually had this presentation set up on a laptop that I'm not currently not using. So if I'm a little bit slower, it's just because like things are laid out a bit different on my desktop PC. But yeah, it should hopefully things still go smoothly. So yeah, as Gavin mentioned, we're going to split into two parts, 2 hours, take a break and come back for the second half. And I'll make sure to leave some time at the end of the session for questions. And like, feel free if you like have a pressing question that's maybe related to specifically what I'm talking about. Like, yeah, feel free to interrupt. I'm happy to answer questions in the midst of things. Don't feel that you have to just wait until the end. But just know that, yeah, at the end there will be a question period. And yeah, apologies about not being there in person. I really wanted to come, but yeah, the Air Canada was out of my hands. Um, all right, so let's move on to slide number 2. So yeah, once again, I'm Andrew. I'm principal animator at Brace Yourself Games, which is a small indie studio in Vancouver where I live. And we do indie titles, very small titles. I'm part of a team of maybe 6 right now. And yeah, I can't say a ton about what I'm working on, but yeah, it's pretty cool. It's maybe you aren't familiar with the job title of principal animator, but just to give you a little idea of what that role entails, it really differs depending on what studio you're talking about. But at Brace Yourself, it's kind of an amalgamation of creative, technical, and directorial and design. So my core responsibilities in a day are obviously just crafting animations themselves and making character animations, prop animations, NPCs, enemies, all that sort of stuff. But then there's a very strong technical component as well, where I have to actually export those animations from Maya and bring them into whatever engine we're using. And this particular game is Unreal, and making sure that all the animations are playing nicely with the different systems of the game. So yeah, I would say that if you're looking at gameplay animation as a career as opposed to just other forms of animation, it really helps to have a technical mindset, or at least an interest in learning that stuff, because you're going to be a bigger asset to a team, especially if you're only on a small team. Being able to get things stood up in an engine and working. If your skill set kind of stops at the creative side and you're just tossing it over the fence, you're kind of maybe better suited for just like working in film or television or stuff. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just gameplay is unique and it's more technical job requirements. And then there's a directorial side as well, where I'm responsible for figuring out, what style of animation are we going to use? Is it going to be very cartoony, or are we going to go much more of a realistic route where we're using motion capture and we need to like hire actors and stuff? And or is it going to be like more of a stylistic approach? So yeah, it's very kind of like the expectation is pretty much completely on me, because I'm really the the beginning and end of animation. There's no other animators at the studio, so when it comes to all things related to making things move, it's kind of it's on me to kind of figure out what's going to work. So I kind of I think this role is really came at a good time for me because I've been in the industry for about well 16 years now. I got in 2008, and yeah, worked for many different studios, and this principal animator role really leverages all of the work I've done in the past. So um yeah, it's been really fantastic. So if you'll indulge me a little bit, I'd like to go through a little bit more of like my history in animation, so you can kind of see the path I took. Now, there's many paths to get to whatever dream animation job you may want. There's no necessarily a right path, um, but this is the path I took, and I want to kind of take you along on the ride. Um, yeah, so back in 2008, I started at a studio in Vancouver called Bardell, and they're a television animation studio. And I spent the better part of 10 years working there. And I think the biggest thing I took from that place, the biggest asset that I left there was just becoming fast. Um, being Working in a professional environment and being able to create art animation quickly and to the quality level is super important. I mean, that maybe that's kind of obvious, but I think especially with animation and especially in TV, it's especially important because TV is such a fast-paced environment. You don't have really large deadline, or you don't have like long deadlines to just keep plugging away at shots. The time frames you have to work on your episode um, is pretty tight. So being fast is a super huge benefit. So at Bardell, I worked on numerous kids television shows. So we have Veggie Tales in the House, Viva Pinata, Zeke's Pad, Planet Sheen, Monsters vs. Aliens, and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. So Turtles was my final project I worked on there, and it was really a pretty much like a perfect way to end my time there because it was I felt that I couldn't work on anything at Bardell that was going to be better than Turtles. Like I grew up loving those 80s cartoons, so it was really a good fit. I also worked on one film there, which was called The Prophet, and it didn't really get a huge release, a widespread release. It kind of did the art circuit, film festivals and stuff like that. So I suspect that maybe not a lot of you have heard about it. But one of the interesting things about this film is I believe it came out back in like 2013. Um, and it was kind of I want to say it was sort of like the precursor to a lot of the films that are being done now that meld 3D and 2D elements together. So similar to like what the Spider-Verse films are doing now and what the latest Ninja Turtles film did, where it's animated in 3D, but there's a strong 2D influence incorporated. That was what the Prophet was doing back in the early 2013 2012 period. So we would do all our animation in Maya in 3D, and then afterwards there would be a toon shader applied to it to get kind of a cool toon look. And we actually had some ex Disney artists who came and actually did paint overs and actually added some cool flourishes, some cool 2D elements as well, effects, smears, and stuff like that. So if you get a chance to see it, it's pretty beautiful. It's like it was pretty unique for its time. And I like to say that it was kind of doing what maybe sort of the Spider-Verse films did with regards to the look, obviously not the action and stuff like that. But it was sort of like doing that cool 3D, 2D aesthetic uh, way back in 2013. So yeah, check it out if you get a chance. So then within that 10 years of working at Bardell, there were when contracts finished, because pretty much most of my career has been contract based. I'll work like, one production that may last a year or 2 years or a few months or what have you. And when that contract ends, often it will roll over to another contract at the same studio. But there were some times where that wasn't the case. And so on the occasions where I didn't have a project to roll onto at Bardell, I worked at another studio called Goldtooth, and they were quite different than Bardell. They were I describe them as like a game adjacent studio, so they do game cinematics, not gameplay itself. So there I worked on Prototype 2, Little Big Planet Karting, Sleeping Dogs, and Deus Ex Human Revolution. And we did cinematics and trailers and some marketing material for all those projects. And uh, beyond just the fact that they do game stuff as opposed to television, they also most of their projects are very motion capture based. So just for those who don't know motion capture, it's where the actor puts on a suit and performs, body mechanics or an acting piece or a dialogue or whatever, and they take that data from the suit, put it onto a rig, and then us animators take it and clean it up. So a lot of my duties there were working from that framework of kind of rough motion capture and smoothing out curves in the curve editor and just making things look nicer. Also, because this was a studio I was probably most frequently at back in like 2010, 2011, the motion capture technology was kind of not super was not what it is today. So it wasn't able to capture, or at least we never captured things like fingers or hair or like a lot of detailed facial features. So a lot of my work was focused on hand animating hands and facial features and accessories, clothing and stuff like that. So it was quite a bit different than working for Bardell. Often with motion capture, you're kind of going for a photo reel, or at least as close to a photo reel, definitely more realistic in terms of body mechanic animation. It's not really, I mean, with some exceptions, it's not the most stylized thing. So yeah, I felt that it was, I really uh, was happy to gain the experience of working with motion capture, but I think working there made me realize that I do like animation where I'm able to like push things beyond what the human body can like do. So I really gravitate more towards doing things that involve a lot of squash and stretch and smears and all sorts of flourishes and stuff like that. So there wasn't a ton of that at Goldtooth, but it was still really cool to finally get a little bit of taste of working in games. So then, as I mentioned, I was working pretty much ping ponging back and forth between Bardell and Goldtooth over the course of 10 years. So then, around 2016 was when I was working on Ninja Turtles at Bardell. And that the studio had been working on that show for about 5 seasons. So I came on for the fifth season,
The great
and
show.
I learned that they weren't actually going to be continuing on for a sixth season. And I could have rolled on to another project at Bardell, but I took that the fact that they weren't going for another season of Turtles uh, as a kind of point to think, why did I get into this industry in the first place? I grew up playing games. I wanted to get into animation because I hope to work in games, and I really have never done it for these first 10 years of my career. Maybe now is the time to kind of take a look. And I looked at some of the game studios that I was aware of in Vancouver that had rejected me in the past, and it turns out that one called Next Level Games was hiring, and I did a couple interviews and was offered to come work on Luigi's Mansion 3. So that was super exciting. And this was right around the when the Switch was just about to be released. And at the time that I was interviewing, I didn't even know what the next system was going to be. I think it was still codenamed like the NX or something at that time. And also, Nintendo is very secretive about what kind of information they release about what they're working on. So even before I signed the contract, I didn't even know what the project was. I just knew that it was going to be a Nintendo project. So that was pretty much enough for me. It was super exciting, and then I discovered it was Luigi's Mansion 3. It was just like it was amazing. So I was fortunate to spend 2.5 years working on that game, and yeah, really awesome place to work. One of the really cool things about working there was that over the course of the 2.5 years of production for this game, um, every so often the executives, the client from Japan, Nintendo of Japan executives would come to Vancouver for what's called a summit, and it was basically where they would be in our studio for um, a week at a time, sitting in on meetings, checking to see where the game build was at, and just making sure that the game was on track the way they expected it to be, and giving lots of notes. So it was sort of like, you could sort of think of it as like a crunch type period, although typically game crunch is more weighted towards the end of a production. And this was, these week long summits were interspersed throughout production, but it was crunch in the sense that we were working longer hours, which because it was such a cool project to work on, wasn't too bad. But one of the really cool things about the summit was, like, near the end, we'd all just kind of gather at the end of a workday. We'd gather in the kitchen and they'd order some food and have some drinks and stuff, and we got to sit down and just talk with the
Like
people
so much,
from
right?
Japan, via a translator, because often they didn't speak too
Gotcha.
much English, and not a lot of us spoke Japanese. But I was super fortunate to be able to sit down and speak with Kensuke Tanabe, who, if you don't know, was pretty much the mind behind what we North Americans know as Super Mario Brothers 2. So if you're familiar with that game, and retro gaming in general, you know that Mario 1 that came before it was it was quite a departure from what Mario 1 was, the original Mario Brothers, in that Mario Brothers 2 had much more of a vertical scaling element to it. So yeah, just being able to sit down and pick his brain about how he came up with that design was really, really cool. And another little tidbit, which maybe you already know, I mean, I know this is a you guys are in a game development course, so I'm sure you're probably aware of some of these things, but I'll mention anyways that Mario 2 is actually a reskin of a different Japanese game. So Tanabe actually had designed the verticality of this game for a different Japanese game, and then it was actually reskinned to Mario for North America. So yeah, it was this kind of a funny story behind that game, and it kind of explains why it was so different, uh, because it never was intended to be a Mario game, but it works really well that way. So then that takes us to about, let's see, 2019 when that wrapped up. And at that point, I went to another studio similar to Goldtooth, which is called Waterproof Studios. And yeah, they're very similar in the sense that they do cinematics for games, trailers as well, and marketing material. Also use a ton of motion capture. And I think one of the big things about working at this particular studio was just the level of detail that they want out of their projects. So, I mean, being a good animator is a lot about just being able to see animation and um, know, excuse me, just know what looks good, be able to analyze motion and be able to recreate that. So up to that point, I felt I was pretty well versed in that. But then moving into a project like Gotham Knights, for example, where I'm getting notes that are like, there's 2 pixels here where it just kind of jitters a bit. Please smooth that out. Or like this character's walking gait is just a bit off, and like there's a bit of a hitch. It's like it really forced me to really scrutinize my work to an even higher level and really go through it with a fine tooth comb. Um, and it just kind of underlines the importance of getting other people to look at your work, no matter what kind of artistic work you're doing in game development, or VFX or TV, or what have you. Just being able to just treat your work as like, never really fully being done, and always trying to track down where you can make it better. That's probably the biggest thing I took away from working there. Yeah, so yeah, I got to work on Gears Tactics, which is like an XCOM style turn-based strategy game. Gotham Knights, which is kind of like the WB Batman games, and then briefly did like a bit of like pre-production stuff for Hogwarts Legacy. So yeah, that was where I was for maybe a year and a half. And I I was always thinking while I was there that I do want to get back into gameplay, because having come from Next Level, where I got my first taste of doing actual gameplay animation, I really wanted to get back into that world. And another opportunity came along, maybe like around 2021, and that was for the Coalition, where I got to kind of continue working on gear stuff. Uh, I'm sorry, I just clicked my Discord, but you guys can still see everything fine, right?
Yeah, everything looks good still.
Okay, hopefully you can
I
still
don't know.
see everything. Um, so yeah, I got to work at the coalition. I worked on two projects there. There was an unreleased game that was that I worked on briefly there, and then got to work on their main tentpole franchise, which is Gears of War, which is yeah, their obviously their big one. And that was my first experience really working more in engine. So when I was at next level, they have like a proprietary engine they use there, and I didn't really ever have to work with that tool. They had enough resources there where they could just they had dedicated engine people. But working at the coalition was the first time where I was starting to learn about exporting animation sequences and building animation montages. And these are things we'll go into in more depth when we get to the Unreal portion in the second half of the presentation. But yeah, still working with a lot of motion capture data, and maybe like 25% working in Unreal. It kind of piqued my interest working there for maybe jobs that would be more Unreal focused, because uh, the coalition is several hundred people strong. So there's departments that specialize more in the Unreal side of things. So it wasn't really a huge expectation for me to dive in there, but the fact that I wanted to made me kind of want to. It could see myself at some point in my career working more in depth in Unreal. Um, so once I finished my 18-month contract there, I took a little bit of time off to do some just like personal work, and actually some of the gifts that I had in that earlier slide was work that I did when I was between studios. Um, so also during that time was when I was kind of doing my own research into Unreal and learning, realizing that it was, very much an industry standard engine, and totally free, so very accessible. I thought it would be a wasted opportunity not to even to learn it a bit. So I took a bit of time to kind of learn the basics, and then was lucky enough to get a job at Brace Yourself Games, where I'm at now. And yeah, now as I mentioned, with my duties are mixed between the artistic side of things, which is the Maya centric stuff, the technical side of things, which is the Unreal side of things, and then the design stuff as well as the design and directorial stuff. So I feel like it's really well suited to me because I do love problem solving. And for those of you who've set foot in Unreal or any engine uh, at any capacity, probably realize that things break quite often, and you need to be able to figure out how to get them to work. So yeah, there is a lot of satisfaction in uh, figuring that how to get things working properly. Okay, so thanks for indulging me for a bit of my backstory. Let's talk a little bit about what we're actually going to do today, like the meat and potatoes kind of stuff. So we're going to learn the basics of animating in Maya. Now, from what I understand, this is you guys are quite new to game development. I'm not sure how many of you are artists versus more like programmery types, but I think believe Gavin mentioned that had more of a programming understanding versus artistic stuff. So that's great, because I don't want to kind of
Thumbs up.
tell you things you already know. When we get to the Unreal portion, you may know a lot about that stuff already, because
Unreal.
it's when we start talking about blueprints and that sort of stuff. You may be a little more familiar if you have a programming background, but for the artistic stuff, it's going to be kind of like level one stuff, and hopefully you find it rewarding and helpful. So we're going to learn the basics of animating in Maya. We're going to kind of cover some of the principles of animation, as well as best practices within Maya itself. We'll create a small locomotion set, an idle and a run. We might have time to do a walk as well. We'll just see how time goes. I kind of timed this out, and I think I have definitely enough to fit within the 4 hours we have. But depending on if we kind of rip through any sections, we'll throw in a walk as well. And then we'll learn the basics of working in Unreal Engine as a gameplay animator. So obviously, Unreal is a super powerful tool. You can do all sorts of things. You can, create films. You can do crazy lighting and all sorts of cool effects. We're just going to focus mostly on the animation side of things. So hopefully you don't are all experts in that area already, and the stuff that I'm telling you isn't redundant. But yeah, we'll be just dealing it to the extent that it applies to animation related stuff, because that's how I use it on a daily basis. So what we'll do is we'll import a custom character and our animations that we built in Maya into the engine. And then we'll set up an animation blueprint, which will allow us to manage and transition between our animations. And we'll set up some basic blueprint logic. So before we dive into the Maya portion of things, I just want to talk a little bit about how game animation differs from other types of animation. So this isn't necessarily an exhaustive list, but this is just kind of like the primary things that I think about when differentiating between animation for games versus like film or TV. So as I mentioned before, it really helps to have good technical ability, strong technical ability. Not only must you be a competent animator, but you must also understand how to work in a game engine where the art and technical sides merge. So yeah, I mean, when I was technically a gameplay animator at Next Level Games, but I didn't, like I mentioned, I didn't have to go into the engine too much. But to really kind of move into the higher levels of gameplay animation, like as a lead or a principal, you need to be able to at least get things stood up in an engine. So yeah, it's much more suited to people who like that balance between creating the art itself and also understanding that um, the you're not only informed when you're making animations for a game, you're not only informed by the way an animation looks, but also the way it plays and its responsiveness. So that's where the technical side comes in, and bringing it into engine, playing it, tweaking it. That's all part of the gameplay animation animator's responsibility. So if you're unable to get it into the game and play it and hook things up so that it plays the way you want it to, you're going to be kind of a bit. You're not going to be as well suited to the role. So yeah, I mean, tons of resources to learn this stuff, and hopefully you learn a little bit about what I show you here to give you that technical side. Teamwork and collaboration. To get the most out of your animations, animators must work with designers, engineers, audio engineers, and other artists to understand how their work integrates with the overall game. So, I mean, no matter what role you fill in a studio, whether it's a game studio or a TV studio or a film studio, there's going to be some level of collaboration and teamwork involved. It's lesser when you're a junior. So when I was at Bardell and as a junior animator, I was mostly tasked with just creating the animations, submitting them to my lead, getting feedback, fixing up the notes that my lead gave me, submitting them again, and rinse and repeat. So a lot of my day, I could just like, pop on my headphones, plug away in Maya, make the animations, and submit them. Um, as you move further up to like when I moved into a lead position on Turtles, I was sitting in on meetings and looking at storyboards and pinpointing where there might be issues with continuity between shots, scale issues, framing issues, all that sort of stuff. And I had to discuss these things with other departments, such as the layout department or the rendering department or the audio department, and really understand how they work in order to for us as animators to do our best work that would fit well within what the other departments expected. So as you move up in seniority, you definitely have to have more of that collaborative and teamwork mentality. And then with gameplay, I think it's probably at its highest peak because gameplay is very very collaborative. You're involved in play tests where all the different departments are playing the game together and figuring out what's fun. um, if you don't really if you're unable to understand how the engineers are developing systems, or say how the audio department is creating triggers for audio cues and stuff like that, your work is not going to be as strong as it can be, because a lot of times what a system requires is directly related to how an animation is authored. So like if you're making an animation that is, 30 frames long as opposed to 60 frames long, you're going to need to discuss with the audio engineer, okay, when do you want that footstep audio cue to kick in, because your animation are the footsteps of that walk cycle going to be every 5 frames or every 10 frames. So there really is a high level of collaboration that's required. It's not really as well suited to just being able to work in a silo. So it's part of the fun of it for sure. But I think that's people who are maybe a little more introverted might not be as well suited to gameplay animation, just because you really have to be able to understand how the other departments are working. Design sense. Although your primary responsibilities are more focused on the crafting of individual animation assets, you will also be involved in meetings where the discussion will center around designing the game itself, establishing game pillars, mechanics, systems, etc. So this ties into the teamwork side of things. Every day at my studio, we have probably at least one meeting, often two. We have our morning meeting where we do a stand up and just discuss what uh, we as individuals are going to be working on. And we often have meetings spread out throughout the week that are more centered around design, aesthetics, gameplay. And in order to be I'm able to contribute to these other meetings, especially ones that involve like design, it helps to have an understanding of what makes good design. So um, even though my primary responsibilities are animation focused, I kind of know what I like to see in a particular genre of game. As far as like design sense is concerned, like how do I want the enemies to react? How do I want maybe building to function? How do I want should we have like a day and night cycle? Is that going to be interesting? So these are kind of areas of that depart a bit, that veer off from specifically animation, but they're still super valuable because if you're able to contribute design sense from through the lens of your own more focused tasks, such as animation or engineering or audio, that's super valuable because there's so much kind of prototyping that goes on that is often fueled by different perspectives on design. There obviously are specifically design positions, professional designers, but design can come from so many different roles as well, and that's still very valuable. So playing games, I suspect that you guys being aspiring game developers, you play a lot of games. Really try to understand why you think this particular game, what makes it fun, what systems you like, and if you're working on a game that is in the same genre as a game you enjoy playing, consider implementing similar types of mechanics to your games, which I suspect a lot of you are already doing. Uh, Nonlinear development process. So unlike animation done for TV and film, which is much more of a linear pipeline, game animation often takes steps backwards in order to move forwards. Shots will be created, brought into game, played, tweaked, played again, and perhaps tossed out if the goal of fun isn't being achieved. For someone accustomed to a more assembly line approach, this might feel counterproductive, when in fact it is a very common approach to game development. From every shot that is tossed out, the animator learns what is working and what isn't. So this was one that uh, took me a while to kind of accept, I guess is the word, or embrace. Because, like I mentioned, I spent 10 years working in TV under pretty tight deadlines. Often we would, as animators, would do our work, kind of toss our work over the fence to the lighting or rendering department, and we'd never see it again. It would be kind of like a one and done. I mean, you would definitely submit your shot to your lead and get it back to make some fixes. But once it moved on to the next department, it was pretty rare that it came back because the deadlines, the schedules just didn't really allow for that. So it was very linear in that sense. And game animation just really isn't like that. It's much more fluid. There's, most that the game studios I've worked at have a pretty extensive prototyping phase where you're just throwing things against the wall and seeing what's sticking. And it kind of made me feel that when I was like making animations and they were ending up in the game, and then maybe they were then removed from the game, or they were scrapped before even making it in. It made me kind of question, am I doing valuable work? Like my work isn't ending up in the final product like it used to with my work at Bardell and Goldtooth and those other studios. I must be doing something wrong, and that's not the case. Game development is about you know things ending up on the cutting room floor. And with every shot that you work on, with every piece of with every asset you put in and maybe remove, you take away some lesson that, this is why this didn't work. The next piece that I author is going to be different, and I take the lesson I learned from that animation that was maybe too long or too short, and I'll adjust that. Maybe I'll be able to adjust it itself, or maybe I'll just scrap it and start from scratch. And that's all just part of the process. So being able to accept that and not become too precious with your work. That's a saying that is very common in all art disciplines of game development and TV and film. Is just don't become too precious with your work. Understand that it is valuable regardless of if it makes it into the final build or not. It does serve a purpose. And finally, every angle counts. In animation done for TV and film, the camera is fixed, whereas in video games, the player often has a lot of freedom to control the camera. Therefore, the animator cannot get away with cheats that are often utilized in fixed camera productions, such as leaving limbs, accessories, props, etc., that are off screen completely static. So we're going to be using the third person template for Unreal, which is a common style of game where the player can control the camera, and you have to expect that the player is going to move the camera to maybe not the most flattering angle of your character. So you got to make sure that when you're animating that idle cycle or that run or that weapon swing, that the character is as balanced and as appealing as possible from every angle. Obviously, you have your primary kind of more focused angle that the camera will return to when the player is off the stick, but and that's the angle you're kind of favoring for sure. But you have to remember that you can't have, to the extent that you can avoid it, you can't have, limbs clipping with other objects. You don't want to have, just because the character's legs are out of frame on that default camera, you can't leave them completely static. They have to have some movement. um, and in TV, like, we did that all the time. If the framing was, waist up, it didn't matter what the legs were doing. I mean, the only thing we really had to consider for things that were off screen, such as limbs or heads or what have you, was the potential shadow that they might cast in a weird way. But outside of that, we would kind of just focus on what was on screen. So that's something that I think you have to remember when you're authoring animations is, always have that perspective camera moving around, and ensure that you're checking things out from as many angles as possible. So let's talk a little bit about the animation process before we jump into Maya. So as new animators, often you just want to jump into an engine, throw a rig in there, and start creating this amazing scene you have in your head with, a crazy group fight scene with swords and martial art moves and crazy explosions and all sorts of set pieces and wild camera moves and all that sort of stuff. And that's all well and good, but often what you're imagining in your mind is not where you want to stop the reference gathering process. Um, Reference gathering, and sorry, don't want to insult your intelligence, but I just wrote out descriptions for all this stuff just to make sure it's super crystal clear. The act of gathering videos and still images to inform your animation. Reference is not meant to be followed and recreated perfectly. It is primarily used as a framework upon which the artist can build. Often when we imagine something we want to animate, our mind omits certain very important details that, when missing, really take away from the quality of the final piece. Using quality reference fills in those gaps that our mind leaves out. So if you want to do that crazy fight scene, go on YouTube, try to find a quality martial art moves or body mechanic moves from as many angles as possible. Grab some still images, film yourself. All of that stuff is going to be helpful. I think the reference that served me the most was that was more professionally done. Often, and by that I mean like stuff that I would find on YouTube where if it was a body mechanic uh, performance, it was something that was just done that wasn't for the camera. It was kind of more just this person, is maybe like that they're playing a soccer match and someone's filming that more discreetly. That was often the best reference. But when the person is actually performing for the camera, such as when I would film myself doing reference, it wasn't ever really that strong because I think, especially if you're aware that you're trying to perform something, it's not going to be super authentic. So, and beyond that, if you're not really quite suited for doing a particular movement, that's also a barrier as well. So if you're more athletically inclined, sure, you can film yourself doing, you know, a martial arts roundhouse kick or something. But if you're not maybe as well suited for like an emotional acting performance, it's probably better to find some professional reference or take a little more time to find something that's more believable and more authentic, because your animation is really probably only going to be as good as the reference you gather. So if you're the shot you filmed of yourself is subpar, that suggests that your animation is going to be subpar as well. So again, it comes back to being able to observe what good movement and performance is. And that often just takes time and practice. But still, getting reference, having some form of reference is better than no reference at all. But try to lean more towards stuff that is of a higher quality. Thumbnails. It is not mandatory to be able to draw to be a 3D animator. I spent the majority of my career not really being able to draw much of anything well, but as my career progressed, I started to understand why many of my instructors at BCIT highlighted the importance of drawing as a supplemental skill that will greatly improve your animation skills. Excuse me. Often 3D animation is trying to achieve a 2D look. If you're able to convey line of action, volume, form, appeal, etc. on a piece of paper, then you're more likely to be able to recreate that in 3D. So yeah, I would suggest if you aren't already doing it and you want to be an animator, taking some life drawing classes, super helpful. It's not, the purpose of that would not be to be able to create some amazingly rendered drawing with, you know, perfect anatomy and great shading and, you know, amazing perspective. It's really about just being able to convey things like um, as I mentioned, line of action, getting a really a solid gesture. If you can quickly, if you have an idea in your head of what you want to animate, and you're able to quickly sketch out some of the key poses you want for that and show that to your lead, that kind of ties into the whole being a fast animator thing. You're getting an idea out there quickly, getting it in front of the eyes of your lead, and they can kind of tell you, yeah, you're on the right track, or you know that looks good, but maybe try framing it this way instead, as opposed to just like jumping into Maya, bringing your rig in, learning about the rig, and then positioning the rig into the pose you want, maybe even animating it a little bit, only to find out an hour, 2 hours, half a day later that this is not really working. It's about trying to find um, to quickly create the look of what you're trying to achieve in as short a time as possible, and thumbnailing is a great way to do that. So even with like stickmen, that can be super helpful. I, I like to sing the praises of an old animation instructor that I had through iAnimate, Jason Ryan. He's like the guy who runs iAnimate, but he would actually, when he was animating, he would actually you animate just with a stickman drawing. So if you wanted to animate a character like running and then like jumping off of a bridge or something, rather than jump right into he would actually create little thumbnail drawings, and he would create so many of them that would actually create the animation itself. And then he would import those thumbnail drawings into his Maya scene and then just pose the character over those. So he would basically figure out the animation before even uh, jumping into Maya, which is, you know, it's a technique that maybe not doesn't work for everybody, but it's just another reason why I think that the artists who kind of, or the animators who have some level of 2D skills, whether it's life drawing or painting or also, you know, photography, just fine art skills in general, super helpful to kind of be able to supplement your animation work. And I think it's also important to mention that and being a strong animator is about exercising those supplemental art skills as well. So getting away from your computer and getting out and actually observing things is of high value as well. You don't always have to be sitting in front of your computer to actually, you know, churn out the animation. I often found that, you know, working for long, you know, numerous hours is not really the best way to treat the animation process. Getting out and just thinking about what you're working on outside of the workspace, super helpful as well. So I don't want to get too off track with that sort of stuff, but yeah. definitely don't neglect just pencil and paper as being a super valuable asset in animation. And then finally, visualizing the shot in your mind's eye. So I put this last, and I kind of think that it's maybe these are in order of importance as they relate to the animation process. This is just, yeah, sitting back and trying to visualize what you want to animate in its final form. So, you sit back, you picture where all the characters you want in your scene. What's the camera perspective? What's the lighting like? What set pieces are there? Are there things in their hand? Are they holding props? What effects are present? Trying to see exactly how that shot is going to play out in your mind is a helpful part of the animation process. Now, this is often what a lot of animators do, and then just skip the reference gathering and thumbnail portion, and then their work doesn't really um, look that great because they're not conveying the weight the way bodies actually show weight and balance and that sort of stuff. So this is an important portion of the animation process, but devoid of reference gathering and thumbnails, it actually can be pretty detrimental. So you don't want to stop at just sitting back after visualizing your shot and then just jump into Maya because, like I said, your mind often omits the important nuances of body mechanics, of facial expressions, those little minute movements that as observers we look at and say, oh yeah, that doesn't quite look right. That is not really as appealing as it could be. So just keep in mind, you want to make sure that you have that reference to supplement your what your imagination initially creates. Okay, so now let's jump into Maya and start setting up a scene. Um, okay, I'll just stop this. And I probably need to share my Maya screen now. So let me just see here. Okay, I'm going to share Autodesk Maya. And I think you guys can see that. Well, okay. So, I don't know how many of you folks have used Maya before, but we've got it open, ready to go. Where do we want to start? Let me just get to my notes up here. So, just a quick
Sadly,
little tour
we're stuck
through.
using Blender, but we'll try and follow along as much as we can.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I haven't used Blender much, but I do. The layout is the same. The techniques I'm going to show you are essentially the same.
Beauty.
Um, so first things first, a little tour. You have your workspace here. Um, the main the main things I think are important with Maya as it relates to animation are the workspace where your characters and props and everything will appear, as well as your timeline down here. And then two windows that are really you'll probably use a lot are the graph editor, which is here. Oh, can you see this graph editor over Maya, or is it only literally showing the workspace?
Windows. So you're sharing your screen. You might want to make sure that you're sharing your whole screen rather than just the
Oh, okay. Hang on a
specific
second.
software.
Yeah, that's what I think is the problem. Okay, one sec. Let's share. Uh, oh, screens. Okay, here we go. Okay, there we go. That's better. Um, yeah, so graph editor here. The other window that's important is your outliner, which is just a list of all the um, assets in your scene. I am also using a script called Animbot, which is what displays all these tools down here. Um, this is a paid add-on, which kind of this makes animation a lot easier. But everything I show you here doesn't require Animbot, but just be aware that again, as to underline the importance of being fast, any tools that you you find, any scripts you find. I'm not sure the extent to which Blender uses scripts or built or bespoke tools, but explore any kind of tools that can make your work faster and leverage those as best as possible. There's no, some people think it's kind of like cheating or whatever. I am totally on board with, just using the tools at your disposal to make your work the best it can be. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about how we populate a scene. Oh, one other thing I'll mention is that the importance of hotkeys as well. Again, in the interest of being fast, it's good to set up hotkeys. So right now I have my outliner set to Alt X and my graph editor set to Alt C. So just quickly, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but if you go to settings and preferences, down to the hotkey editor, here you can set up custom hotkeys. So I won't go too far in depth with that, but again, in the interest of being fast, leverage this system so that you kind of set up Maya in a way that you can access things as quickly as possible. So when you're populating a scene, you want to be using referencing. So as I mentioned before, we're talking about using reference to build to inform your animation. The way in which I'm using the word reference now is a different way. So I'm talking about the reference editor. So if we go up to File and go down to Reference Editor, and that's over here, we have another window that pops up where we can actually bring in our references. So these can be anything from characters to lights to props to whatever. So we'll start off by bringing in a character. We are going to work with, okay, I gotta find my, so this is where like I had things set up on my laptop, which is a bit different. So I just need to track down the rig we want to use. So bear with me here. Mhm.
I had a question for you.
Yeah,
How
go
do you,
ahead.
yeah, obviously as an animator, this kind of affects you in a decent amount of ways. How do you feel about software like Mixamo and Animate Everything and stuff like that, where it sort of takes care of the rigging and has some of those prefab animations?
Yeah, I've briefly looked at Mixamo, and I think it's a good kind of starting point. I think its benefit and it's beneficial in being able to just get a bunch of pre-made animations to kind of get your game stood up. So if you have a game where you want like a character to run and then it's idle and then like wave, you
Yeah,
can use Mixamo to get those animations. I think they kind of, if you want to actually be a gameplay animator, you want to use those animations just as stand-ins with the intent of eventually swapping them out for animations that your team or that you yourself created. Um, as far as like, and also using those, if your goal is to like, be like a game developer, then that might be, producing a game with Mixamo animations or pre-made animations from the Unreal Marketplace or whatever. That might be okay to send to like a company. It's like, here's a showcase of what I can do. I hooked all these animations up and made gameplay systems, because there you're actually showcasing your gameplay development skills that don't relate to animation. But if you specifically want to work in a studio as a gameplay animator, you want to showcase how you can actually build animations and have those in games. So make sure you're
sure, yeah.
making unique animations that you're able to showcase to a studio in order to get hired as a gameplay animator. But if you want to just get hired as a designer, you can probably stop at just using those Mixamo animations.
Makes
Does
sense.
that make
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, awesome. Um, okay, so I found my rig. So we're using the Raphael rig. So I'll just click reference and taking a while. Oh, okay. Not sure
Sorry
why
about
it, yeah, I mean, if another thing about Maya is that it's got a bad reputation of crashing a lot. So
Save a
um,
lot, control less.
yeah, we'll try that one more time. I think I have this rig saved in another place as well, so I'll maybe that might be a better place to grab it. Let's see.
Fair enough. If you wanted to, you could send that to me over Discord or a version that we could use to follow along with, and I could share it if that's okay.
Um,
Or is there a
sorry, I
different
didn't catch.
character?
What did you say? Sorry.
I was just saying, is there a character? Could that one be shared with us to follow along with, or is there a different character that you'd recommend we go hunt online and grab?
This character, yeah, you can. This character is accessible. I can send a link to it. Are you thinking you want to like have the link now so you can get it and then like people can open up Maya on their computers and just
That's what I
follow
was
along?
thinking. If we wanted to try following along, or
Okay.
when
Yeah. Let me just let's see if this is actually gonna work first. Okay, cool. There's
I gosh, this time.
we got something working. Okay. Hang on a second. Let me find. Give me a moment here. So one resource that's really useful for animators and not even specifically gameplay animators is the Agora website. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but they are they're pretty much entirely animation focused, and they have a huge resource page of rigs and what have you. So I'll just link you that for now in the interest of keeping things moving forward.
For sure, yeah. No,
Um, okay, I just sent a link to the assets page, and there's like tons of. There's actually they have Blender and Maya rigs. I don't know if they have a Blender Raphael rig, but if they do, and people are more comfortable working in Blender, then they can do that as well.
sounds good. I'll share that with everyone.
Awesome. Um, so here's our Raphael rig. He looks kind of weird because he doesn't have any textures on him right now. So let's see if we can fix that. Uh, so if we just click on our character and then we go over to our attribute editor here, if we go over to our Raph shader, we can change the out color. So the out color is already pointing at one directory that is probably incorrect. So let's find a better place for that texture. Because we want him to look all pretty. There we go. This is what he's supposed to look like. So we got our Raphael looking awesome. So this is essentially what a rig looks like. You have your geometry, and then you have your rig controls here. So these are all the rig controls. You got a head control, which you can translate and rotate. So W is to toggle translation. E is to toggle rotation, and then R is for scale, which is grayed out because we don't need to scale his head up. So referencing super important because, and did I actually reference this right? Let me just make sure. You know what? I did not reference this character. So I actually made I did things the wrong way. So actually I want to stress the importance of referencing. So I'm just gonna start a new scene and we'll reference our character in again. And the importance of referencing is that it allows any updates made to the asset you reference will be updated in everybody who's got that reference in their scene. So if the modeling department decides to make Raph's head larger, as long as the animators have that character reference, they're going to see the benefits of that scale change right away, as opposed to just opening up Raph in a its own scene. So make sure you're using the reference editor. I don't know if Blender has a similar option for that. I know that 3ds Max, at least when we were using it at Next Level Games, we didn't have the benefit of referencing, or at least we weren't using any sort of referencing, which made things a lot slower and more challenging. So yeah, if you're working at Maya, it's pretty much standard procedure every Maya studio I've worked at to reference in the assets.
It looks
So
like
let's go
Blender
ahead and
has an
get.
alternative called linking.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so different word, but same idea, I suppose. Okay, let's get the textures. Where are we going here? Rigs. Hey, where is I? Um, okay, now we're back up and running. Good stuff. And we got our character referenced. Okay, so next thing is that when you're animating, you often only want to be able to select the controls because those are what you're going to be setting keys on. You don't want to be able to select the geo itself. So if you go over to this display, this little display window here, you have different layers of things that are in your scene. So here we have an all controls layer. This V means that it's visible, so I can toggle those on and off. Same with this geo layer, I can toggle that on and off. Now, if you want to make this particular layer that's got all the geo on it unselectable, we can just click in this little box here and set it to R, which just means that it's like a reference. So now we can no longer select the geo, but our control layer can still be selected. So we can still move around all the different controls and what have you. So the next thing we want to do is create a selection set. So a selection set is just a method of being able to select any number of controls you want quickly and easily. So rather than just like, selecting the head and the wrist and the foot and then setting a key, maybe you want to select all those in one go. So in order to do that, you would select those three objects and you would go up to create and go down to sets, quick select set. And based on what you have selected in your viewport, you will make a quick select set of those objects. So we actually want to make a quick select set for all of our controls. So if we can actually just do a box select, and that will select all of our controls. And we can just go to create, sets, quick select set, and I'll call this one all graph. And we can add it to our shelf. So up here we have our shelf. All these tabs here correspond to different shelves. So the one shelf we're on right now is anim tools. I'll just throw it on my anim tools shelf right now. But generally speaking, you'd probably make, like, if you were working with the RAF rig, you'd maybe make a shelf called RAF, and you would make a selection set for like his left arm, his right arm, his entire body, his left leg, his right leg. But we're just going to make the one button for everything. And we'll click add to shelf. And then now we have an all RAF button that allows us to select the entire rig. So whenever you got controls selected, you generally want to set keys on them to set a keyframe. So in Maya, that's just S. So down on our timeline down here, you'll see we have a little red tick that denotes that we set a key. So if I scrub forward to frame 10, I can set another key, frame 20, so on and so forth. If I just hold shift and left click and drag, I can highlight those keys and delete them. Now, an important setting that I think by default in Maya is turned on, and it should be that way when you're animating, is auto key, which is this little red button down here. Now what this does is, if I were to go forward to frame 10 and then rotate Raf's arm up like that, you'll see it automatically set a key on his arm. So now at frame 0, his arm is keyed down there, and frame 10, his arm is keyed up there. So the same will hold true for if I move any control. It applies to any control that you've already set a key on. So basically at the outset, you want to set a key on all your controls. Then from that point on, every blank frame you go to and then manipulate your control, it's now going to set a key on it. If you didn't set an initial key on that control, it won't automatically set a key on it. It has to have that initial key that you physically set yourself for auto key to work. So now all these are keyed. And the reason this is really important to do I'll just delete this key. The reason it's really important to have auto key turned on is that, like, say for example, I go to frame 10 with auto key turned off, and I make like some complex pose where that's like that, and that's like that, and that's like that, and that's over there, and this is over there. And I spend like, oh, we got the messed up rig. Oh, okay. There is a version of this RAF rig that is messed up. I think this is the one, so I'm actually going to swap it out for a different one. But that, we can do that after this. Um, yeah. Anyway, let's say I spent like, you know, 20 minutes setting this pose, and I've got it looking just the way I want it to. And then, okay, I forget to actually select all my controls and set a key. And then I scrub to like frame 20 where I want to set another key. You'll see that it just popped back to his default pose. And the reason that happened is because we didn't set a key, it defaults to the key we had set at frame 0, which was this default pose. And there's no way to get that pose back. You can't hit Control Z to undo what you did. You have to basically build the pose from scratch. So if you had auto key turned on, it would have automatically saved that pose. So that's why I like to keep auto key on, because oftentimes I'll build a pose and not even think about hitting S to set a key on it. I'll just move to the next keyframe and start doing that. So keep auto key turned on is the takeaway. Now, as you noticed, yeah, this when I moved his main hip control, I got some weird deformation there. So that's because I do recall I have like a weird version of RAF on this computer, which I don't want. So I'm gonna swap him out. Now the one I have is from my Unreal project. So let me try to find the proper one. So just bear with me. Again, this was all like better set up on my laptop, but yeah, we can still make this work. So we can just actually where is it? Replace reference. So we can swap out the reference we were using before and use this one instead. And hopefully this one works properly. Let's see.
What's the difference between just deleting it and adding a new one, or using the replace function? Does like something move over between the two, like it changes, for example, or?
I think if you replace it, if you delete it, I believe it's going to remove like all the keyframes you may have set. And then if you bring in a new one, you're not going to have those
Doesn't.
keyframes. So if you want to, like, yeah, if you use replace, assuming all the controls are named the same, it will maintain all those keyframes.
Very cool.
Okay, so that one is also not right. So I might actually have to just remove this one. Remove this reference. And give me a moment here. Were you able to access the RAF rig yourself?
I signed it with my LinkedIn and that worked. The only problem is we don't have Maya on these computers right now, just Blender, and the Blender one doesn't exist for that specific model, and it's too different. So it's better just follow along and learn
Okay,
by
feel free to grab other Blender rigs that aren't RAF, because there's a ton on there. I mean, the idea is still going to apply. Everything I'm teaching here is transferable to other rigs as well. Anyway, okay, we got our proper RAF in now. Let's get the textures updated. Shader. And RAF texture. Okay, so now you'll see that the character is moving properly. So another important part of animating is, before you decide to like jump in and start animating a rig, make sure it works the way you expect it to. So go through all the controls, play around with them, make sure that everything is working as expected. Usually when you download rigs from like any of the websites that are fairly well known, there'll be some sort of like known issues page. So be sure to peruse those and go in as informed as possible when working with a new rig. Once you get accustomed to it, yeah, its capabilities, you're fine. But you definitely don't want to be like committing to a rig that you're unsure if it can achieve exactly what you want it to do. Okay, so this rig seems to be working fine. So the next thing I want to talk to you about is, let me just check my notes here. So we tested the character. When I'm setting keys, I have to actually let me check. Let me make a new select all. Okay, reference. Grab all these controls. Create sets. Quick select set. All RAV. Okay, so when you, there's different ways to animate, but generally speaking, the one that's probably kind of most traditionally taught is frame by frame animation. So that's setting keyframes, blocking out keyframes over like if you have a 30 frame animation, you're basically blocking out the key poses over the course of these 30 frames. So if you have a character doing a run cycle, you'll maybe make one leg back and one leg forward, and you'll, oh, did I not make, I didn't make a button for this one. That's okay. I can just grab the other way. If you didn't make a button for your quick select set, you can access it by going to select, quick select set, all RAF. Oh, I guess I didn't delete the other one. All RAF, and then you can just set a key like that. So maybe at frame 0, you set a key. You then would go to like frame 15 and you'll do like the opposite pose. Bring this leg back and bring this leg forward. And then you'll select all RAF again, and see it automatically set a key, so that's good. And then we could copy this pose at frame 0 to frame 30. So if you want to copy a keyframe, you can just go to the frame that you want to copy. And if you middle click and drag, that will maintain the pose of the frame you were initially on. As opposed to if you left click and drag, you see it actually updates the frame. If we middle click and drag, it's going to maintain that frame 0 pose. So if we maintain it until frame 30, then we go to frame 30 and hit S again with all our controls selected. Now we have basically copied that frame 0 pose to frame 30. And now we have like, very basic, ugly looking walk cycle. So this is essentially frame by frame animation. So you're setting keyframes at intervals throughout. And that's as opposed to straight ahead animation where you're literally going frame 0, the character is going to look like this. Then frame 1, the character is going to look like this. Then frame 2, the character is going to look like this, and making very more minute changes. I prefer the approach where you're making more broad changes and then filling in the gaps as you go along. Now, if you look as I scrub through my animation, there's motion happening between frame 0 and frame 15. And I generally don't want to see that at this stage of my animation. I only want to see motion. I only want to see the pose changes on the frames at which I've set keyframes. So by default, Maya is interpolating between these frames, but I don't want that. So if I go up to Windows, Settings, Preferences, and then go to Animation here, you'll see that the tangents here are set to auto span and auto span. I like to change those to default in tangent being flat and default out being stepped, and saving that out. So that will ensure that as I scrub through my animation, this pose at frame 0 will be maintained up until the point that I hit frame 15, at which it will instantly pop to my new pose. So I did change that setting. So now subsequent poses that I set will be set that way. But these current frames will still stay interpolated. So if I want to change them to that stepped look, I can just highlight all of them, and I can just click down on my tool shelf here, the step tangent button, and that will now make them stepped. So you see that now as I scrub from frame 0 all the way to frame 15, it only pops at frame 15. So now if I set, like, because I changed my preferences, now if I set a new key at say frame 7, let's say, I lift this arm up like that, and this arm like that, and rotate the head like that. You see, we're getting that pop. And that just allows me to focus on the keyframes that I specifically set. I'm not seeing any extra motion between the frames that I didn't actually set. Maya is the one that's making this motion in here, and I don't want to see that until I get to a later stage of animation. So I recommend that you work in that stepped approach versus having interpolation between your keyframes. So let's just delete all of that right now. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is okay. So actually, let's animate something. So like I mentioned earlier, we're gonna animate a basic idle and a run cycle. And I realize I think we're gonna break probably around 1. So I want to at least try to get an idle done in the next 40 minutes or so, so we can actually have something to to work with. So because in the second half of class, of this talk, I want to focus more on the Unreal side of things, but we probably will still do some more Maya stuff. But that's okay, because like honestly, the Unreal stuff is a little bit lighter in terms of content. So I'll just grab my entire character, and so just as an aside, actually, before when I said I was going to delete all those keyframes, I didn't have the entire rig selected. So I think I only deleted the keyframes on like the foot or something. So make sure if you want to delete all your keyframes that you have all your keyframes selected, and then you can drag and delete them all. So I want to get Raph back to his default pose. So I'll just grab the foot, and the channel box over here will show you any changes to transforms or rotates or other parameters that you've made. So you see that we've translated the character's leg a little bit. So I'll just highlight those and hit 0. And that way his foot is back to a 0 pose. Okay, so let's start off by animating an idle. So as I mentioned, part of the animation process is about, before you jump in and start animating everything, you want to make sure you take time to gather reference. Now I'm going to be one of those people who is going to say, do as I say, not as I do, because gathering reference obviously takes time. And I want to get something that's, I want to get some animation done before we hit a break. So if we take too much time gathering reference, we're going to eat into our break time, and I don't want to do that. And also on my laptop is where I actually had some reference already gathered that I was going to show you, but I'm not on my laptop. So basically, you want to take the time to find like good reference of like an idol. So for example, if this character is like a superhero, he's like a ninja, he's a strong, muscular dude. It's probably good to find like look at maybe some bodybuilder posing or some superhero posing, and try to find something like really cool and heroic. And know that like this idol pose is going to be the pose that your player character in your game is always going to come back to. So you want to take some time to make it look pretty solid. So how long is an idle going to take? Well, right now, we've got 30 frames in our timeline here. And if we look down here, actually, our timeline is set to 24 frames per second. I'm actually going to set that to 30 frames per second. Unreal defaults to 30 frames per second. So I like to have those two matched up. So I know that my animation here, when it's brought into Unreal, is going to match up 1-to-1. So Maya tends to defaults to 24. So I like to change that to 30. And I think for our idle, it's going to be longer than 1 second. So let's maybe make it like, let's go with 90 frames, which would be 3 seconds. And you know what? Let's save before we do anything else, because I don't want to lose any of the work I've done. So I'm just going to save this to my desktop for now, and I'll just call this RAF Thompson Rivers University demo. Okay. We'll just save that there for now. Okay. So we can just hit play and get a general idea of how long this animation is going to be. So yeah, 3 seconds. That seems pretty good. So we'll start out by grabbing all of our character and we set a key at frame 0. Let's go about halfway through. So frame 45. Actually, before we do that at all, let's get our first initial pose. So, I actually forgot to mention one important thing. So before you even start animating, you kind of want to set up a secondary camera to the perspective camera that we're currently using to kind of mimic what our gameplay camera is going to look like. So if I go up to panels, perspective, new, I can create a new camera and I'll call this shot cam. And I'll just kind of get it in the general position of where I expect it to be in the game. So if you look at like, if you played a lot of third person action games, you can kind of mimic their angles, which is kind of what I'm doing here. So I'll make sure I've got the camera selected by just going view, select camera. So that selects the camera that I'm currently looking through. And it's selected because it says shot cam up here. And then I'll just hit S to set a key. And to make sure that I don't actually accidentally move this camera, I can just highlight all of these channels up in the channel box, right click and lock selected. So now I can't move this camera anymore. It's locked. And I'll also turn off the controls because I don't need to see those in this particular perspective. I just want to see my character. So then I'll go to perspective, or actually I'll just go to panels and I'll tear off a copy of this particular camera. So now you can see I've got a separate window with just this camera, and I can use my main window to go back to my perspective camera. And I can turn my controls on here. Oh, so by the way, just as another thing to mention, when you turn off the controls in this panel here, it turns off the controls for both these windows. So if you want to just turn off the controls for this particular window here and not this one, you can go to show viewport, and this gives a list of all the things that are currently visible in your scene. So if you turn off untick NURBS curves, it'll turn those off. So now we just have a clean shot camera, and down here we can manipulate all our controls and we'll still get oh no, we'll still get motion the way we expect it to. Okay, yeah, I just realized, yeah, this is a very very finicky rig. I just realized that, yeah, this rig, so it's this it appears to be like the same. I'm having the same problem I had before where this geo is uh is deforming really strangely. And I think it's when you set a key on a certain control. So I actually have to do a little bit more troubleshooting. So just give me a moment. I totally forgot about this issue. So I think if I delete that, yeah, okay, there's some control. I'm not sure which control it is. Okay, it's not that control. Okay, we might actually be animating in a slightly different way. So just be aware, okay, this rig, I remember it gave me trouble before, and I believe I set it up in a way that circumvented that problem. So there's some control that when you set a key on it, like if you notice, like now that there's no keys on any controls, this main controller moves the whole character as you'd expect. But the moment that I set keys on everything, now when I move this control, it does this weirdness. So it might be, I wonder if it's this control here. So this is just part of this is part of studio life. You run into issues and you have to solve them. So even though I don't want to have too many issues, it's part of the process. So it's actually kind of, it's not too much of a departure from what I actually do. Okay, it's not that control. It's not that control. Okay, we'll just I'm going to delete these two. And I'm going to make a selection set for, let's turn off the geo here for a minute. Let's see, let's set a key there. Turn that on. Yeah, it's still broken. Yeah, there's some control that gets keyed and then just kind of breaks this this rig. So where are we? Okay, we're just going to key things a bit. We're going to key things a bit more individually. And that'll just be the way we'll have to work. Okay, so we're going to start off by building our first pose. So let's get a little bit of a, hang on a second. Let's get a little bit of a tilt in his body. Maybe we'll drop him down a bit. We'll bend him forward a little bit. And this is where reference really comes in handy, where you can actually kind of really look at reference and study, like, how are the feet placed? You know, where's the weight balance? How are the hips shifted? All that sort of stuff. Now let's make sure. Yeah, character's still working properly. Eventually we'll probably find the control that we set a key on that breaks things. So in the meantime, I'm just going to make a quick selection set of the controls I'll probably be most often using. So I'll grab that, 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 this guy. Set a key, and then we'll create a quick select set. Call it all. Okay. Okay, cool. Select. Another thing I like to do is with the head, generally, like if you see when I rotate my character right now, his head and his arms stay oriented to like the control that I'm moving. And that requires, like, if I was to tilt him over this way, his head probably wouldn't just like stay at the same orientation as his body. It would probably rotate like something like that. And if we actually turn on the head local to world control, set that to 1. Now when we rotate our character, we see the head stays oriented to the world instead. So that's the way I want to have this character function. And we can do the same thing for, I believe, yeah, these clavicle controls. So if you just crank those up to 1, same thing. Now when we rotate our controls, we'll see that the arms actually stay oriented to the world. And that just allows us to avoid what's called counter animating. So it's just a term that means when you animate one control one way, it means you have to counter animate another control the other way to get it the way you would expect it to be. And it's just it makes things very slow. So that's why the riggers have often built in these controls that allow us to circumvent that. So let's just zero that one out. Okay, so this is not necessarily going to be the most beautiful pose, but we're more focused on getting something passable so that we can get it into the game and play around with it. But generally speaking, I would spend a good amount of time getting this pose and this whole idle cycle looking nice, because like I said, you're always going to be coming back to it. But you want to look, you want to look natural and appealing. So let's pull this arm back a little bit.
You
So
mentioned
again,
that
we're
the
making sure. Oh, was
sorry,
there?
I was just gonna say you mentioned that the riggers typically have like set up these controls and stuff like that. Would you consider rigging to be like a separate profession from animating then?
Yes. In my studio, because I'm the only animator there, I'm expected to do the rigging. So we don't have a rigger, a bespoke rigger. But at bigger studios, like where when I was at NLG and the Coalition, they definitely had a rigging department. So typically, if you're in like a smaller studio, um, you might not have the luxury of having a rigger. So I think as an animator, it makes sense that you would have some at least interest in learning rigging because it's directly related to what you do. Um, but yeah, I think the size of the studio really determines whether you'd actually have to leverage any rigging skills as an animator. Um, I
Would you say
think
there's a
it does.
similar connection there for like 3D modeling as well, where it's like 3D modeling to rigging to animating, sort of some smaller studios might combine those all into like one job, or
Yeah, I mean, again, where I'm at now, I've had to do a little bit of modeling as well. Definitely rigging. It's kind of like you kind of look to the studio like who has the most skill in something we need right now. Oh, Andrew knows a bit about rigging. He's probably the best person to get something rigged rather than somebody who has no rigging experience. So it's kind of like you look to and also like the job description will lay out if you actually need rigging experience. So that'll give you an idea if you're actually qualified to to um to apply for the position. But yeah, I would say at indie studios, if you're being hired as an animator, because resources are fewer in smaller studios, you'll probably be expected to do some form of rigging. And there's lots of tools out there that make it a lot easier. Like there's a lot of auto rigging tools like M Gear for Maya, as well as Advanced Skeleton. I recommend learning a bit of Advanced Skeleton for Maya. It's super awesome tool. Um, yeah, so you don't have to be like super like the because rigging, takes a lot of time to become really good at it, just like animation. So yeah, I would say that as an animator, it's probably makes sense to learn at least the basics of that stuff.
like
Okay, so now we got a pretty decent first pose. So I'm going to go back to. I really want to make a button for this control, and there is a way to do that if you didn't make a button initially. And I'm just trying to remind myself. I believe if you go to this and you hold. Okay, yeah. So another cool tip is if you want to make a button from like functions you have uh, on your on your drop down menus here. If you hold Control Shift and then middle click, you'll see it actually will create a button for whatever you just had selected there, and then you can rename it and everything like that. So I'll just delete that. So because I didn't make a button when I initially created that selection set, I just used that Control Shift middle click to make a button after the fact, and that works just the same. Okay, so let's keep moving forward. So let's go about halfway through. So this idle cycle is going to be kind of like Raph, just kind of like just breathing, just kind of keeping alive, nothing crazy complex. We're going to keep it really simple. So I'll consider the 0 frame, like where he's like inhaled, and then we'll consider the pose at frame 45 where he's exhaled. So I'll just drop his hips down a bit. And if we inhale, our the upper part of our torso kind of bends back. As we exhale, we kind of compress a bit. So we can pull his torso forward. We'll drop his shoulders down a bit. And always making sure that we're looking at our primary camera here to see how things are looking in a kind of more gameplay environment. So I've made a very basic change of pose here. If I want to jump between these poses on frame 0 and frame 45, I can use the comma and the period key to jump between them. So this is really important in being able to see if your poses um, are changing enough, creating enough of a noticeable change of shape on screen. So I'm seeing here like the body looks pretty good. I'm seeing some nice rotation in the shell. The arm still feels kind of like quite stiff. So I maybe want to straighten out this arm a little bit as it comes down. So I'll pull this arm down a bit and I'll straighten out the forearm a bit. Still not quite what I want, so maybe I'll rotate it out a bit. I think I'll rotate the wrist a bit. Okay, so now we're getting a bit of wrist rotation there. It's a little bit more noticeable. The upper arm still feels a bit stiff, so I'm just going to tweak this a bit more. Maybe pull it in. Okay, that's quite exaggerated now, so we'll stick with that. Because I'm not seeing this right arm too much, I maybe don't need to pay it as much attention, but remember, the player may actually rotate around the character quite a bit, so we can't completely ignore it. So let's straighten this arm out a little bit. And rotate that. So if you look here, we can see a little tiny bit of the right finger here, and then we see quite a bit of it. I feel that's a little bit distracting, so I think I'll pull this arm a bit forward. Okay, that's not too bad. The feet are pretty stiff, but I probably wouldn't really want to move them too much because when you're just standing there breathing, idling, you're not just going to slide your feet along the ground. There's no reason to do that. They do feel a little bit stiff, so maybe just to get a bit of motion in them, I'll raise the heel up just a tiny bit. I believe this control here has an option for, actually, I think if you just, okay, yeah, you just rotate this control, this square control, and you can get a tiny bit of heel rotation. Okay, and I just realized this control wasn't part of our selection set, so I have to make sure I set a key for it on frame 0 as well as on frame 45. If you want to add controls to your selection set that you didn't initially have, I believe you can go to your outliner, and if you go to your outliner, you can see your selection sets in here. So we can see, where is it? Quick select set, all RAV. Okay, all RAV here. So if you open up all RAV here, we'll see all the controls that are in there. And I believe if you just grab a control like that, and I think if we middle mouse drag down to all RAV, yeah, I think we just placed it in there. So now that should be part of our selection set. So I'll do the same with this one too. It's middle mouse drag, kind of slow, and just drag that into all RAV. Okay, so now I got both the foot roll controls in there. So now if I do select, or if I just select my control, my quick select, if I set a key, yeah, I can see that a key was set on those new controls I added. So let's give a tiny bit of rotation there, just so they're not feeling like totally static. Yeah, you know what? I don't really love that too much. It looks a bit weird. It looks like he's kind of like leaning forward. So we'll just leave it as is. That's fine. Okay, let's keep moving forward. So we'll copy our frame 0 pose to frame 90. And so now we have our very basic idle cycle blocked out. Now I'll look at it at this point to see if it kind of like is starting to feel like the right timing, the timing that I would expect for breathing. To me, it feels maybe a little bit slow. Like if I try to picture myself breathing, like that, that feels maybe a little bit too slow for me. So I think I'm gonna reduce my duration to maybe like 70 frames. So I'll bring this guy back to frame 35 and this guy back to frame 70. So to move frames around on your timeline, um, again, you just shift and click. So shift and click allows you to highlight ranges, or if you just click on a frame, you can just select that individual frame, and then you can left click and move it around. And then to get rid of the highlight, you just click somewhere else. So let's shorten our frame range back to 70. Let's see how that feels. Okay, I think that's a bit better. So we'll just stick with that. Yeah, I could spend an hour just tweaking the timing of the animation, but we don't want to spend tons of time doing that. So now we can maybe build in an in-between. So an in-between is basically just a frame that comes between your keyframes. So these are our main keyframes on frame 0 and 35 and 70. So you want to kind of break down that motion. Like, how does Raf get from this initial pose to this down pose? Does he kind of like go up a little bit before going down, or does he just like come outwards, like pull his arms out and go down? There's any number of ways he could like get into this, go from this pose at frame 0 to frame 35. So let's just go to frame 17. That's about roughly in between, in the middle. And a really handy script that you can get. It exists on the Animbot shelf, but you can just access it free as like a separate tool. It's called Tween Machine. So basically what it allows you to do is Maya will look at your two keyframes, and based on those two keyframes, you can set an in-between that basically interpolates, finds the exact midpoint between those two keyframes. So this is the tool down here. If I click right in the middle on Tween Machine, you'll see now it's created this yellow key, which now creates a exact midpoint between these two keyframes. And there's other buttons to the left and the right of this TW button. If I were to click one further to the left, it means that it's going to create a pose on the same frame here, but it's going to favor the pose at frame 0. So I could click this one here, and now this pose here is much closer to frame 0 than it is to frame 35. So we'll stick with that. I'll go over to frame 54, and we'll do a pose that favors frame 70. So now we've quickly just blocked in some in-betweens. We can take a look and see how that looks. So you can kind of see that feels more like a breathing cycle now. I would want to tweak the timing a little bit. It feels very even. And when I say even, I mean that each keyframe that shows up takes exactly the same duration of time to get to as the next one. So from frame 0 to 17, that's 17 frames. 17 to 35, that's like another 18 frames, so almost the same. Then to get to this one, another 18, and then here another 17. So if we were to like kind of move these keyframes around, like maybe move this one here and this one here, that's going to break up the kind of even feeling of this animation. So we can just move that and test it out, see how it feels. Let's try moving this frame 10 to frame 26. Now, to me, that feels more like a breathing cycle. It's kind of like he quickly goes down to that more crunched pose and then quickly pops back up. This feels like a breathing cycle um, that is kind of more exhausted. Like if he had just finished a battle and then now he's doing like a heavy breathing cycle. That's what this feels like to me. So let's quickly go in and like tweak these poses a little bit more. I think I want to pull his arms out a little bit as he comes down. So here what we're applying is a little bit of what's called overlapping animation. So as he goes down, his arms are kind of overlapping. They're dragging backward. As he's pulling down, the arms aren't coming down at the exact same timing as his torso. They're kind of dragging up and then they're coming down. So you see they drag up and then they come down. So that just creates a little bit more visual interest. Let's raise the shoulders up a bit as they come down. And then as he goes back up, let's drag the shoulders down a bit. So almost like they're heavy weights as he's moving up, they're kind of dragging down a bit, and then they'll eventually catch up to the rest of the body. We can pull these arms in a bit. Now let's see how that looks. So you can see the arm is kind of like has a little bit of drag on it. That's what we want. So let's quickly go in and maybe build out another in between here. So let's go to this frame here. Maybe we'll create a frame that favors our pose at frame 0. We can build another in between here. That maybe favors our frame 35. Let's see how that looks. I don't love that pose at frame 44, so let's tweak that a bit. Instead, what I want to do is I want him to hit this down pose and then compress a little bit further down after the fact. So he hits this down pose. It's quite abrupt. I want to have a little bit more of like an ease in, what they call an ease in. So easing in is just kind of like softening that movement into the pose. Right now it's very harsh. So if we just if we turn this frame 35 into a pose that is close to the pose at frame 44, but not quite there, that's going to soften things. So I'll use the tween machine again. Ah, that little pop-up always comes up. So now you can see it's a little bit softened there. Let's see how that looks. Okay. Now, if we look here, you can kind of see that our frames are getting that kind of even spacing again. So let's break up that a little bit. And at this stage, this is just like, there's no science to this. It's really kind of just experimenting. At this early stage, you can get away with just like experimenting with moving your frames around to get the timing you want. As you animate more and more, you'll learn what timing will work. Okay, that's feeling a bit better. This pose at frame 61, it feels a bit poppy too. So let's ease into that pose as well. So as we come out of frame 44, we want to soften the movement into this pose. So we'll maybe make a pose that favors frame 44 here. Let's see how that feels. So that's feeling a bit better. The arms are looking a bit weird right around here. So I think as he starts to lean down, I want to drag that arm in a bit. It feels like it's kind of like arbitrarily pulling out with not much motivation behind it. So let's actually drag it in a little bit. It doesn't feel very organic. Drag these fingers in a bit more. Maybe drag this arm in a bit. And as he comes down here, let's drag this hand out a bit. And then drag it in a bit more here. So really trying to get like a nice overlapping feel. Pull this arm in just a bit because it kind of pops onto screen. And then we can drag this wrist a bit and drag it in more here. So you want to make things feel organic and, like an actual, little looser. Okay, let's put a couple more poses in there. I think we got about 7 minutes left, so um, we'll get this character, this animation to like a half decent level. It's not going to be perfect, but it'll be good enough for what we're trying to do. So I'm going to scrub through and just try to identify areas that feel a bit too poppy and try to smooth them out a bit. So if you look in there, you see that arm is a bit poppy there. So maybe I could go in here and set a key and then just like kind of break that down a bit. So you want to avoid any kind of like really big distracting poppiness. There, the arm kind of pops again there. So maybe here, pull it out a bit. Yeah, the shoulder kind of pops a bit. So let's pull that up. So always making sure to look in our shot camera, but also keeping cognizant of what's going on here. There's some crashing happening here. I'm not going to worry too much about that right now. Again, we don't need to make this animation perfect, but basically when you're working in a studio environment, you're going to want to be scrutinizing your work and actually fixing these things because obviously you have more time. We just don't have the time for that right now. I think I'm going to trim this animation even more. There's this kind of space here that's kind of dead, and we don't really need all this dead space here. So I'm going to grab this and drag it back by like 10 frames. So maybe our total animation will be like 55 frames. Let's see how that looks. Okay, I think that's feeling a bit better. Since we're on 30 frames a second, I'd like to make it exactly 2 seconds. So let's make it 60. And we can just space this out a little bit more, maybe like space that out a little bit like that. Maybe space this out a bit. And let's do that. So again, this is kind of arbitrary, but we're really just going off how it feels, how it looks. So this is what we're going to be seeing in our gameplay window. Um, so it's not perfect, but I think for what we're trying to do, it's good enough. Um, okay, we're like 3 minutes before we want to take a break. So I'll take this moment to kind of talk about what I want to do when we come back. So what I'll do when we come back is my plan was initially to have build an idle cycle as well as a run and a walk. I don't know if we're gonna have time for all of that. So I do have a walk. I'll have to track it down, but I think I have a walk or a run already built, so we can kind of look at that rather than build one from scratch. But we will take a little bit of time to take this idle and spline it out because I do want to show you like the next stage. Because obviously we're not going to be exporting an animation that's got all this static these static frames in here. We want to have something kind of smooth there. So I want to show you a bit of the process behind that. And then once we've done that, I'll show you how we export the animation and talk a little bit about the FBX file, and then we'll jump into Unreal. So um, maybe before we break, are there any like questions about what we've discussed so far?
Let me look around the room here. Anyone got questions so far? I know in the Discord there, I've shared in the game dev Discord. There's the link to the student license and a few of the name drops of the different softwares and stuff, as well as a couple of command prompts that I was able to capture there. So it doesn't look like there's any questions just yet.
Okay. Sorry, what did you say? There was something in the
Yeah,
Discord. There was.
so in the game dev Discord, I went ahead and tracked down how we can get student licenses and posted in there, as well as a few of the different things that you've said, like the different softwares and extensions. I've typed those up for people just so that they can find them easier.
Oh, okay, gotcha, gotcha.